Welcome to the Caffeine stream on caffeine and philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the Caffeine stream. My name is CB Robertson, this is episode 23, and today we're going to be talking about pornography. Yes. Now, this is not really a discussion of whether or not pornography is bad. That's sort of a given. And we'll go over the reasons why that's the case here. But I wanted to make this more interesting and ask maybe a more controversial and debatable question. And that is, should pornography be banned as like a law, as a federal or state? Well, it probably wouldn't make sense at the state level since the thing at issue here is really internet based. So should pornography be banned? I mean, because there are many things that are bad, but should maybe not be made illegal. And my favorite example is, of course, seatbelt laws. It is good to wear a seatbelt in your car. However, there are some arguments against giving the government the power to make that illegal. And so we'll be going over, and for the record, I actually don't have a very strong position on this. I can see the arguments from both sides for banning it and for not banning it, and I'm torn. I don't have a strong opinion on which it should be. I have my own sort of negotiated middle ground, which I'll present at the end here. So we'll see which arguments are more persuasive to you, and I'll try to go through them as best as I can. So first of all, why is porn bad? I said that's sort of a given here, but we have to go through it. And I think this can be broken down into three different categories. There's the ways that porn is bad at the personal level. There are the ways that porn is bad at the relational level. And there are ways that porn is bad at the societal level. So at the personal level, the first thing to say about pornography is that porn is an addiction, or it can be an addiction. It's probably the most widespread addiction among men in the United States and in the world more generally. Now, there is a valid point of view that can say, well, everyone is going to be addicted to something. Choose your addiction. You can either be in the CrossFit cult, or you can be in the meth crowd. And methamphetamine and CrossFit are not equal. They're not comparable to your overall life. So maybe if you're going to be addicted to something, choose CrossFit. But porn is more in the direction of meth than it is in the direction of CrossFit, if you want to lean into that belief. I've been on a huge Andrew Huberman podcast binge the last week and a half, and I can't recommend him highly enough. Really excellent, especially his guests. I have heard some people who are very knowledgeable in the field say some negative things about him as well. They have some criticisms of him as well. Most of the criticisms come down to him and his takes on certain things, like he's not super scientific. I wouldn't imagine those criticisms would apply to the guests that he brings on. So even if you hold those criticisms, I think it's still worthwhile to listen to him and his interviews of very knowledgeable guests. And the one in particular I'm thinking of is Anna Lemke. But there have been many others relating to the physiology and neurology of addiction. I'm not going to repeat the stuff he said about the dopamine system, but the important takeaway are that first of all, speed matters. How fast something is uptaked into your system is going to have an effect on how addictive it is. So one of the examples he gives is that vapes are actually far more addictive than regular cigarettes. Full disclosure, I smoke cigarettes. I smoke American Spirits, and I have like a cigarette every week, sometimes a cigarette every 2 weeks. It's funny, when I go in for physicals, the doctors will always ask, do you smoke? And I say, sort of. And they're like, well, smoking sort of like you're pregnant or you're not. Like, how much do you smoke? And I was like, like a pack every couple months. And they're like, yeah, you don't smoke. That's I might be just weird on that point, but cigarettes can be less addictive because the brand I smoke has a lot less chemicals and stuff in it. But but vapes get it into your system extremely quickly, and apparently that speed is a big part of what makes it so addictive. So conversely, and again from my own experience here, I left the military with an ulcerative colitis diagnosis. There's actually some literature suggesting that smoking cigarettes, or at least nicotine, I don't know if this is cigarettes specifically or nicotine more generally, but can induce remission in ulcerative colitis. Now, I probably don't smoke enough to actually do that. I'm just in, as idiopathic remission as it was idiopathic in the onset. But I like to bring that up for people who get on my case about it. But ulcerative colitis is an interesting one because in my case, it was food allergen triggered. Supposedly, it's hard to gauge any of these things for certain, but there's like the way it was explained to me, if I ate certain food allergen triggers, I would get a reaction, days, if not weeks later. And that delay made it extremely hard to stay diligent and stay consistent with that diet. Conversely, with addiction, it's that immediacy of response that makes certain actions so addictive. So anyways, long tangent on the point of speed and its ability to build associations in our brain and so forth. Any kind of addiction, and here we're speaking generally about addictions, and pornography as a subset of addiction that has these addictive qualities. It can reduce our ability to defer gratification. Huberman defines addiction as a progressive, as like a process of narrowing the things that make you happy. And it, of course, as a part of that process, takes more and more of the thing to get the same effect too. But as you lean into your addiction, whether that is gambling or video games or alcohol or pornography, everything on the periphery, everything outside of that one activity gives you, relatively speaking, less dopamine. At a neurological level, it becomes less important. And so we become less happy as well, generally. But we also are less able to defer gratification and to wait for better outcomes down the road as we get more and more acclimated to immediate gratification. Again, it's the speed thing. And the thing that creeped me out the most as a father was the decreased resilience and patience that also comes with being addicted to something. As you get more addicted, other things becoming less important will make you less willing to endure the little bullshit associated with it. Like if you're having an argument with your spouse, as a normal person, you're like, okay, I'm gonna push through this argument. But when all of your happiness comes from this one source, and it isn't even your partner anymore, then all of the negative, disagreements and arguments just become intolerable, because they're not getting through it isn't even going to give you happiness anymore. And so you become less patient with your spouse, less patient with your children. All of these are risks, and of course by degree. And finally, being addicted to one thing increases, apparently, and again, I'm going on Dr. Huberman and his interviewees' research here. It increases your ability to become addicted to other things as well. So that's a lot of things bad with just addiction generally. And pornography is a particularly potent subset of addiction, because it does all of these things. Our sex drive is a very, very powerful drive too. So we can get a lot of happiness out of that, or a lot of dopamine and pleasure and so forth. And of course, in the age of the internet, we can get it very fast. So as an addiction, it's bad. It also, and here we're speaking about pornography, not addictions generally. Pornography can corrupt our sexuality. Now, in regular sex, all of our senses are involved, and olfactory smell is particularly strong, but touch as well, and taste. Can't get around that. With pornography, you're reducing that to just sight and sound. Mostly just visual, but sight and sound. So it flattens sex, and it associates sex with these two dimensions rather than with all five. It also makes sex into something observational instead of participatory. And here, I can't emphasize enough the importance of repetition in forging who you are. When I was in martial arts, you weren't just shown how to do a technique once and then you knew it. You were shown how to do a technique, and then you did hundreds of repetitions, and then you were corrected, and then you had to relearn it and do hundreds more repetitions. And our teacher used to say, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect. And so most of martial arts was really repetitive drills of things we already knew how to do over and over and over again, to drill them into our heads until they became second nature. And that's what real learning is, in my opinion. It's the material I've learned intellectually has not been from books that I read once and thought, oh, that was interesting. It was, stuff like the Christopher Hitchens Defense of Hate speech, which I listened to probably over 120 times and had the whole 20-minute speech memorized at one point. I have listened to Nietzsche's audiobook on The Birth of Tragedy over a dozen times. There are books that you keep going back to. You keep rereading again and again and again. And that's how you really internalize things. When you watch pornography over and over and over again, it rewires you, as any repetitive activity will. Narrowing your sensory experience of what sex is about, and making you into primarily an observer rather than a participant. So those are two big problems that in the corruption of a man's sexuality. And here we're talking about men. We'll get into women later, because let's be real, pornography is primarily a male issue. But finally, in the corruption of sexuality, and here I'm not sure if there's research on this, but I don't think we really need research. There's enough. Any man will probably know enough, anecdotes from friends or perhaps himself, that as you consume more porn, you need more and more to get the same effect. That can mean more and more intensity, perhaps instead of more and more quantity, although it can mean more quantity as well. So this has been known to take men down some very weird and dark rabbit holes, going from sort of vanilla sex pornography, some maybe softcore stuff, into increasingly hardcore stuff. They're, doing anal. They're, heads are getting shoved in toilets. Really, weird stuff. Some people go down the hentai rabbit hole, and the sky's the limit on that. And that can screw people up just as much as the repetition with other things, because of course that stuff gets repeated, and you need more and more. It's that Tool song comes to mind. The name will come to me in a minute, but anyway, so pornography is bad because it's an addiction and because it corrupts sexuality. And finally, I'll say porn is bad at the personal level, and this is sort of a funny aside. It's not as serious as the other two, but it can lead to dysmorphia. Most guys, by definition, are average in length and size and all that. If you don't have a 9-inch dick, watching a lot of porn can give you dysmorphia. That repetition, how often you see porn, that will probably be the most penises you see in life, is watching porn, unless you were in some very odd places or the military. And the repetition of seeing all these penises on the internet it will normalize that as that's what normal is. And I don't have a 9-inch Ron Jeremy dick or whatever. And it can lead to dysmorphia. Now, this obviously, I think, affects women more than men at the broad cultural level. But men, I think it's understated how much this affects men who become addicted to porn as well. And they can get very tragically and needlessly self-conscious because they have this addiction that makes them think that they're in fact much smaller than they really are. Or they lose track of just how ridiculous some of these porn stars are. So that's the personal level. We have the addiction quality, we have the corruption of sexuality, and we have the dysmorphia. Then there are relational problems. If you watch porn as a man and your spouse finds out, your spouse will feel jealous. Even if they say, I am very skeptical of the women who say they don't really mind. I think most women understand that you can, if not earn love by sex, then at least get your foot in the door to love by sex. I've been told that when it comes to, spouses confronting spouses on, who they believe to have cheated or have discovered have cheated, the first question men ask their cheating spouses, their cheating wives, is, did you fuck him? The first question wives tend to ask their cheating husbands is, do you love her? What an interesting juxtaposition. A man is not going to fall in love with the, women that he watches on the internet. Usually, OnlyFans has kind of changed that a little bit, but in the mind of a woman, like our brains are older than our frontal cortexes, and so there are parts of our brain that no amount of logical rationalization can resolve. You can tell yourself all day long that this huntsman spider is harmless, that this giant house spider, which is like the North Western American equivalent to the Australian huntsman, very large, very fast spider, is totally harmless. It won't hurt you. No amount of that kind of logical understanding will stop you from being afraid of that spider if you're afraid of spiders. It's a spider. It triggers something very like primordial and old in your brain that says, get away from that, kill it, that's scary, hide. Same thing with snakes, perhaps. And the same is true with jealousy. If a woman knows that her man is getting off imagining other women, that is going to inspire jealousy and, insecurity and unhappiness. And if a woman doesn't feel that at all, it might mean that they care about you a little less than they pretend to. That might be cause for concern on its own. So it can damage the relationship directly in that way. Porn can. But putting the wife's opinions aside and the wife's feelings aside, I believe porn can actually damage the relationship internally on the man's side. Again, it's that repetition. You're seeing all these beautiful bodies. You're seeing all these women do all these wonderful things, and just unbelievably hungry for dick. Like they're just crazed for cock. It can be very easy with that repetition again in your brain to develop a kind of plenty of fish feeling. Maybe there are more like hot girls out there who would love me and sexualize me more unconditionally than my wife. Maybe they wouldn't have all these weird strings attached and so forth. And it can lead to feelings of detachment. And even if it doesn't, again, we're talking about possibilities. This might affect some people more than others, and of course, everything by degrees and gradations. It's not like a switch happens overnight. This is a byproduct, potentially, of years and years and years and years of repetition. That it just follows the laws of how attention leads to feelings of importance. Once you accept that idea that the more attention you give to something, the more important it becomes in your mind, which is extremely well attested to in psychology and in the fields of persuasion and rhetoric. Everything else I'm describing here kind of follows from that to some degree. But anyways, even if you don't develop this kind of plenty of fish attitude, this gradual detachment from your spouse, it can lead to feelings of resentment towards your spouse for not being as sexually ravenous and turned on as these professional actors pretend to be that you watch. And while we're on that subject, it is worth mentioning here that women don't get off the hook. They, in fact, are the worst perpetrators in this kind of self-indulgence. And here I'm speaking of Nicholas Sparks rom-coms, which are obviously not one-to-one analogs to pornography for men, but they are pretty comparable in a lot of ways. And the normalization of absurd expectations of spouses is at the top. I think men might be, it's very common in the manosphere today to decry the like ridiculizing of the father figure. Look at Peter Griffin. Look at Homer Simpson. Dads are portrayed as these ridiculous people. It's like, yes, it might do that, but it also makes you look like a god among dads in comparison to the most prominent examples of fathers and husbands out there too. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword there. So, it's worth saying that too. So we've gone over the personal issues and we've gone over the relational issues. Finally, and this is I think the smallest case, there are social problems. It's often said that porn doesn't hurt anyone. What's the harm in watching porn? Well, we can imagine cases in which that's true, but oftentimes it does. Pornography is a huge component of the human trafficking industry and the sex slavery industry. Yes, this doesn't apply to voluntary actors, and it certainly doesn't apply to hentai. Yes, come to save the day again. But it's still true that it contributes to a lot of human trafficking. Not everyone is into hentai and tentacle porn yet. So, and I would say at the social level, it's not just the criminal aspects. It's also the negative incentives it creates. There are so many women now who are starting, OnlyFans accounts or getting into porn or becoming Instagram models that border on OnlyFans accounts, that are kind of induced to do that because of the money. And if that woman ever regrets that decision, it's like, oh, maybe I don't want they finally find someone and fall in love with them, and they want to give everything they have to that person. This past will haunt them, and now it will, that past, their body over the internet will hang like a weight around their neck, and they can't get rid of it. And they couldn't have anticipated feeling that way because they hadn't thought that love was on real love, really wanting to give everything to one person, was on the horizon, was in their future. And it's very sad. And I think we can't get around that the porn industry has something to do with it, because there's so much money that men give to women and reward them for doing that kind of thing. So that makes it, I'm putting it in the social cost category, but it's really a personal cost, and it's a personal cost to women. And I think related to that, there's also a dating market effect, not only on the women, but also for the women, in that men are less sexually interested in women because they can just go home and jack off. They don't need to find a woman in order to get those needs met anymore. So men are a little less, perhaps less willing to go out and find someone than they used to be before. There are studies that show that millennials and Gen Zers today are actually having significantly less sex than their age compatriots from the 70s and 80s and even 90s. I think this can all be tied together. It's certainly correlated in a way. So those are the arguments why porn is bad. There's the personal addiction, it corrupts sexuality, dysmorphia, it has these negative relational effects with jealousy and increasing feelings of detachment and resentment, and of course the social parts, the relationship with human trafficking, the negative incentives for people to lean into over-sexualizing themselves, and people not getting together. So against all that, is there some argument for not banning porn? And here I think there are five decent arguments to make. I'm not saying they're decent as in they're all rock solid, but there are 5 arguments worth mentioning. First of all, isn't porn sometimes harmless? Like a lot of people will misuse porn. A lot of people will get addicted and it'll destroy their lives, it'll destroy their marriage, all these other sorts of things. But that's not everybody. Some people can use porn just fine. I have an acquaintance who's in military special operations, and he was like, dude, when we're over in Afghanistan and Iraq for 9 months out of the year, just surrounded by dudes, like, you have to use a little bit of porn. You're not going to turn that down. And it's like, it's kind of hard to hold that against him. And is it really irresponsible on a road to addiction to use porn in that kind of extreme circumstance, and then once you leave that extreme circumstance, you're in a new environment? I don't know. I don't. That doesn't seem particularly dysfunctional. Like on the surface, maybe it is. It's an empirical question, but the empiricism is going to be specific to that person, and we have to, I think, assume that there are some people who use porn in a way that is genuinely not harmful. And should they not be allowed to have fun in this way because other people can't manage it themselves? So that's the first argument, is that porn is sometimes harmless. Which is not like a strong argument for it. I suppose the real argument for it is it's fun and it's harmless. So don't ban my fun. The second argument is, and this is very speculative, but it's worth mentioning, fidelity. Men and women, according to what I've been exposed to as far as research goes, cheat for different reasons. Generally speaking, women generally cheat on their spouses over relational dissatisfaction, and that means like relational dissatisfaction is predictive of infidelity. This is not true with men. Apparently, marital satisfaction is not predictive, apparently, of male fidelity, of husbands cheating or not cheating. The big predictor of male infidelity is opportunity. Seems to be driven by sexual variety. And so, could porn for men possibly fill that gap and keep them faithful? I don't know the answer to this. It's an empirical question, and I don't have the empirical results. It would make sense if it did, though. Now, the obvious counter to that is that, is it really not cheating if you're getting off imagining other women? Like, some women are really bothered by that, and to them it's the same as cheating. Other women say, oh no, porn is like, you're not going to fall in love with the woman on the screen, but you might with the girl in real life. So like, it's fine. My concern would be like, is it worth the risk of developing these sort of sexual dysfunctions that can come from excessive porn use? Like erectile dysfunction has long been associated with excessive porn use. All of these questions come to my mind, but still the possibility is there, and perhaps more porn use could help male fidelity. Third, and here's another sketchy speculative one, but pornography and sexual crime, so rape and that sort of thing. Now this is really murky, and if you dig into it, most of the studies you find will assert that porn is causing more sexual violence. I don't believe this is true at all. I think this comes largely from Ted Bundy and his pre-execution interview with, who is the head of Focus on the Family? Anyways, some strongly anti-pornography Christian evangelists, right? So, and Ted Bundy converted, became a born-again Christian in the days before he died, and so is no doubt in heaven. And he cited, no, it's not my psychopathy, it's the fact that I saw a bunch of porn when I was a kid, and that twisted my mind and made me a murderous psychopath. It's a funny argument on its face when you consider the sheer volume of men who have been exposed to porn in their youth. And if you read anything by Steven Pinker, you'll know that crime and violent crime generally have been on a fairly steady decline. Now, the data on sexual crime and rape and so forth is a little bit tricky. It has been on a decline since the mid-'80s, early 90s, until 2013, when it suddenly reversed course and started to rise. This could be porn. I think that's highly unlikely. I don't think 2013 was a turning point year for the porn industry. I think 2013 was, I hate to say it, a turning point year for immigration. And who was immigrating to the United States? Huge demographic changes have been going on in the United States really for the past 65 years, but that's massively gone in overdrive mode in the last decade or so. And it's hard not to notice the cultural differences in things like rape and sexual crime there. Especially, and I think a really important point of comparison, something that has been more well studied than the relationship between porn and sexual violence, is the relationship between violent video games and violent crime. And here we have almost causation. I don't want to say causation, but we have very, very strong correlation, specifically negative correlation, between more people playing first-person shooter games and less violent crime. More people playing those games, we've seen massive decreases in violent crime. If that is in any way comparable to the relationship between pornography and sexual crime, it might be possible that more, contrary to all, I know I'm going against most of the research here, it might be possible that more porn use is actually resulting in less sexual crime. Again, I want to emphasize this is very, very speculative, and I'm going against the research here, but possible argument. Fourth argument, and this is, I think, maybe the strongest argument. It's the does the government really have the power to ban this? Should the government be allowed to protect us from ourselves? This is not the it's fun argument, so don't stop me from having fun because other people can't handle it. This is the does the government even have the right to protect us from ourselves in the first place? And there are many variations of this point. The classic one is the question, well, what's the line between porn and art? There's always been a very fine line between pornography, obscenity, and art when it comes to censorship. And this is not just with pictures and videos, but also with music and even with books in some cases. You could also argue that pornography itself can be art. I would say most of it is probably not. It sort of depends upon your definition of pornography and depends upon your definition of art. But I can certainly imagine certain Christian groups considering a movie like, Eyes Wide Shut to be essentially pornographic. It, of course, isn't. It manages to be sexual while being somehow anti-sexual. You're not going to get turned on by watching that movie. But it is art, and it's got some deep subject matter going on in that masterpiece of a film. So, there's this danger that banning pornography could lead to it would give the government too much power, and also, who are you to protect us from ourselves and to limit our expression? And that's a very valid point. It's the one that's maybe most compelling to me. But there is a fifth argument, and I hadn't heard this one until Scott Adams brought it up in a live stream a little while ago. And that is, what about the incels? What about the men who have no chance of getting a woman? There is a growing subgroup of men who, due to changes in our cultural environment, changes in the dating environment, pickup culture, hookup culture, we now have, 20% of the guys getting 80% of the women. It's of course not precise numbers, but that's it feels as if we as a society are retransitioning back to a harem mating culture rather than a monogamy culture. It's just a little more spread out in some ways. It's a feeling that a lot of guys are having, and a lot more people are not getting married. A lot more guys are going through life sexually unsuccessful in the past. And banning pornography might be all well and good to married men to guys who are dating, or at least have a hope of getting a date. But for the incels, wouldn't banning pornography just be cruel? Wouldn't it just be like, to take, not only have they been deprived of the opportunity to, have women, haven't they just been deprived also of any kind of consolation or compensation for their, pent-up sexual energy that will never have any chance at success? And it has some emotional punch to it, I think, especially given how cruel society has already been to the men that it has rejected and thrown out. So those are the arguments that porn can at least be mitigatingly good, or at least reasons not to ban it in certain cases. And I'm not sure that they outweigh the harms that porn brings. But I think what we're seeing in pornography is there's a broader conflict that we're going to have to deal with between the freedom that we aspire to and addiction. In insurance parlance, this might be called an attractive nuisance, or proprietarians would call it bait into hazard. Addictions are getting roided up. We're seeing this primarily in the digital space with social media and with political news. Political news can also be an addiction. And human nature is inherently vulnerable to this, to becoming addicted. Ultimate responsibility for your actions is still on you as the individual. But that said, in a given context or environment, with enough addictive temptations, every human being will succumb to at least one of them. If it's not drama and politics, it'll be social media. If it isn't social media, it'll be gambling or alcohol. If it's not alcohol, it'll be crystal meth or video games. I heard a story of a woman who became addicted to water and eventually took her life. We are, our impulse to act is both what makes us human and what makes us susceptible to addiction. And our dopamine reward center, and I'm sure I'm oversimplifying their neurology. I almost don't want to talk about it. We don't need to talk about the neurology to understand the process of addiction, which we're all familiar with. We've all probably known someone who's struggled with addiction, if we haven't struggled with it ourselves. And if we haven't, we're probably deluding ourselves if you're past a certain age. In my case, it's the worst addiction is caffeine, thankfully. Not the worst addiction out there. So to lose one's susceptibility to sexual addiction might require losing one's sexuality entirely. I'm inclined to recount again the work of Matthew Crawford, who absolutely demolished this personal responsibility expectation as it pertained to gambling in his book The World Beyond Your Head. Like the appeal to personal responsibility is often made by the gambling establishments, knowing full well the neurology and psychology that their systems have on the brain. They're designed to work on humans. If you think it won't work on you, you are assuming that you are not a human. That is not how your brain works. And we've seen amusing cases of people like Tristan Harris talking about this with, social media apps, and of course this was worked into video games decades ago. So perhaps, and here I've been going on for quite some time, so I'm going to bring it to a close here. I don't think banning pornography outright is necessarily a good move. But perhaps we could come up with some compromise. perhaps we could ban pornography from the internet. Now, I know that's not actually possible to do in practice. You can't actually keep anything off the internet ever. But you could introduce a whole lot of friction. You could make it very, very difficult to find porn. Porn sites would have to be constantly moving and changing and accessible through weird IP addresses. Pornhub would be gone. I don't know, the other big sites, was like RedTube and whatever else. The big sites would be gone, and it would just be harder to find. And just that friction would accomplish a lot of success in curbing the addiction. And perhaps we could ban pornography from the internet while keeping it legal and permissible in print form, in seedy adult theater form, in other medias that, again, to go back to the relationship between speed and addiction, that make pornography something that is available, and so we would still live in a free country to a degree, but without the speed that the internet provides in getting that. I feel a little torn about the speed thing issue, even because, here in America, in Washington State anyways, buying certain firearms requires a long wait, and it can feel like a bit of an injustice. But you still get them at the end of the day. Am I bothered that I have to wait, 6 or 7 months for certain firearm parts, in my case? Yeah, it's annoying, but I'll still get them, With guns, I don't think that's necessarily justified, because having a gun addiction, while a common joke, that is a real hole in your wallet, and that is perhaps the most dangerous things about guns. Another joke, I'm sorry. Like, guns are not addictive in the way that porn is addictive. Perhaps that friction and reducing the speed of access to porn could reduce at least some level of that addiction without totally reducing access for incels or our freedoms as Americans to enjoy things we find fun and not be protected from ourselves by overbearing governments, or to just do something fun with our spouse if we feel like it, perhaps. So, anyways, I think that's all I have to say about the subject. Let me know in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube or on Instagram, if you follow me there, what you think about this, which arguments you found compelling, if I left anything out, because there's always more to say on this fascinating subject. I want to repeat again, I do think pornography is, on the whole, an overwhelmingly net bad for 90% of people, and if you think you're in that 10%, you are probably deluding yourself, but you might not be. Anyways, thanks for listening. Talk to you later.